The trap is set. On September 22nd, 1985, 5 men walked into a private suite at the Plaza Hotel in New York City and signed a document that would destroy the second largest economy on Earth. The document was 4 pages long. It was written in the dry language of international finance. But hidden in those pages was a financial weapon that would evaporate $2 trillion of Japanese wealth in less than a decade. The men who signed it were the finance ministers and central bank governors of the 5 most powerful economies in the world: the United States, Japan, West Germany, France, the United Kingdom. They called it the Plaza Accord. They told the press it was a cooperative agreement to stabilize currency markets. They said it would balance global trade and create prosperity for all nations. They were lying. What actually happened in that room was a forced liquidation. It was the United States Treasury looking across the table at Japan and saying, "You've grown too rich, too fast. We are going to take it back." And Japan, unable to refuse, signed the paper that would bankrupt an entire generation. If you think America's relationship with Japan was an alliance of equals, what I'm about to show you will shatter that illusion. Because in 1985, the United States didn't just ask Japan to adjust its currency. It demanded that Japan destroy its own economy to save America's. And the terrifying part? Japan had no choice but to comply. The threat. No one saw coming. But before we get to the devastation, you need to understand the threat that triggered this financial ambush. Because what happened to Japan in the 1980s is happening again right now to other economies, and the pattern is always the same. By 1985, Japan had become an economic miracle that terrified Washington. Japanese companies were crushing American industries. Sony was destroying RCA. Toyota was humiliating General Motors. Japanese steel was cheaper and better than American steel. Japanese semiconductors were dominating the market that America had invented. The numbers were staggering. In 1980, Japan's share of global manufacturing exports was 18%. By 1985, it had climbed to 23%. The United States, meanwhile, had collapsed from 17% to 14%. American factories were closing. Entire industrial cities were dying. Unemployment was spiking in the Rust Belt. But it wasn't just about losing market share. It was about something far more dangerous to American power. Japan was accumulating dollars at a rate that threatened the entire structure of the global financial system. Here's what most people miss. When Japan sold cars and electronics to America, it got paid in US dollars. But Japan didn't want to hold dollars, it wanted yen. So Japanese companies would take their dollar earnings and exchange them for yen at Japanese banks. This created a massive imbalance. The architecture of dependence. The Japanese central bank, the Bank of Japan, was sitting on a mountain of US dollars. By 1985, Japan held over $100 billion in foreign exchange reserves. It was the largest creditor nation on earth. And every single day, that pile of dollars grew larger. The American Treasury looked at this situation and saw a nightmare. If Japan ever decided to dump those dollars and buy something else, gold, European currencies, anything, the value of the dollar would collapse. American interest rates would explode. The US government, which was running massive budget deficits, would be unable to borrow money. Japan had become America's banker, and in Washington, that was intolerable. But there was another problem, a problem that would be the public justification for what was about to happen. The U.S. trade deficit with Japan had exploded to nearly $50 billion a year. American politicians were screaming about unfair trade. Protectionist legislation was moving through Congress. There were calls to put tariffs on Japanese imports, to shut them out of the American market entirely. The Reagan administration faced a choice. It could start a trade war, which would hurt American consumers and global markets. Or it could do something more sophisticated, more brutal, and far more effective. It could force Japan to revalue its currency. The secret negotiations? The plan was hatched in the back rooms of the U.S. Treasury by a man named James Baker. He was Ronald Reagan's Secretary of the Treasury, and he understood something fundamental about power in the modern world. Military strength wins wars, but financial leverage wins everything else. Baker's strategy was elegant and devastating. He would force Japan to make its currency more expensive. A stronger yen would make Japanese exports more costly for American buyers. It would make American products more competitive. It would reduce the trade deficit. And most importantly, it would transfer wealth from Japan back to the United States. But Japan would never agree to this voluntarily. A strong yen would destroy Japan's export-driven economy. It would bankrupt Japanese companies that depended on selling cheap goods to America. So Baker needed leverage. He found it in Japan's greatest vulnerability, its dependence on the American market and American military protection. In early 1985, Baker's deputies began making quiet visits to Tokyo. They met with officials from the Ministry of Finance and the Bank of Japan. The message they delivered was simple and terrifying. The United States Congress is about to pass protectionist legislation. Tariffs are coming. If they do, Japanese access to the American market will be cut off. Your economy will collapse, But there is a way to stop this. Agree to strengthen the yen, agree to the Plaza Accord, or face economic isolation. The Japanese officials knew it was a trap. They knew that a rapidly strengthening yen would be catastrophic. They knew it would crush their exporters, but they also knew they had no leverage. Japan's entire post-war economic model was built on selling to America. Without access to American consumers, the Japanese miracle would end overnight. And there was another factor that Baker exploited ruthlessly. Japan's military defense depended entirely on the United States. American troops were stationed in Japan. American nuclear weapons protected Japan from the Soviet Union and from China. If Japan refused to cooperate on economic matters, what would happen to that security guarantee? It was never stated explicitly. It didn't have to be. The implication was clear. Play along, or you're on your own. On September 22, 1985, the finance ministers gathered at the Plaza Hotel. The press was told this was a multilateral agreement, a coordinated effort by all 5 nations to stabilize currency markets. But the reality was different. This was the United States dictating terms to Japan, with Germany, France, and Britain nodding along because they also wanted to see Japan cut down to size. The text of the Plaza Accord was carefully worded. It said that the dollar was overvalued and needed to decline in an orderly fashion. It said that the yen and the Deutsche Mark should appreciate. It called for coordinated intervention in currency markets. But buried in the technical language was the kill shot. The agreement stated that exchange rates should better reflect fundamental economic conditions. And the fundamental economic condition, according to the United States, was that the yen was far too cheap. The Japanese finance minister, Noboru Takeshita, signed the document. He smiled for the cameras. He spoke about international cooperation. But when he returned to Tokyo, he knew what he had done. He had agreed to a controlled devaluation of Japanese competitiveness. He had signed a suicide pact. The mechanism of destruction. Here's how the Plaza Accord was supposed to work in theory. The 5 central banks would intervene in currency markets. They would sell dollars and buy yen and Deutsche Marks. This would increase demand for yen, pushing its value higher relative to the dollar. The process would be gradual and orderly. But that's not what happened. What happened was a currency avalanche. In the months before the Plaza Accord, $1 US could buy about 240 yen. The Japanese exporters had built their entire cost structure around this exchange rate. They had priced their products assuming this ratio would remain stable. Within 3 months of the Plaza signing, the yen had appreciated to 200 yen per dollar. Within a year, it hit 150 yen per dollar. By 1987, it had rocketed to 120 yen per dollar. Think about what this meant in practice. A Japanese company that sold a car in America for $10,000 would receive 2.4 million yen before the Plaza Accord. After the yen appreciated to 150 per dollar, that same car, sold for the same $10,000, would generate only 1.5 million yen. The company's revenue in yen terms had just collapsed by nearly 40%. And the costs of making that car, the steel, the labor, the factories, all of those were paid in yen. They didn't change, so profit margins evaporated. Japanese exporters were being crushed. The Bank of Japan's fatal mistake. The Japanese government panicked. The Ministry of Finance and the Bank of Japan watched the yen surge and saw their export economy disintegrating in real time. Corporate profits were collapsing. Factories were closing. Unemployment was rising. They had to do something to stop the pain. And they chose the one tool that central banks always choose when they're desperate. They cut interest rates and flooded the economy with money. In January 1986, the Bank of Japan's benchmark interest rate was 5%. By February 1987, it had been slashed at 2.5%. The central bank was injecting liquidity into the financial system at a furious pace. The money supply exploded. The official justification was economic stabilization. Lower interest rates would make it cheaper for companies to borrow. It would stimulate domestic demand. It would cushion the blow from the collapsing export sector. But what it actually did was create the largest asset bubble in modern history. Here's what happens when you flood an economy with cheap money while simultaneously destroying the profitability of its productive industries. The money doesn't go into building new factories or developing new technologies. It goes into speculation. Japanese corporations, facing shrinking export profits, started borrowing massive amounts of yen at near zero interest rates. But instead of investing that money in their core businesses, they poured it into real estate and stocks. Because in a world where making cars and electronics was no longer profitable, making money from asset appreciation was the only game left. Banks, awash with deposits and desperate to lend, started giving loans to anyone who wanted to buy property. The lending standards collapsed. You could get a mortgage in Tokyo with almost no money down. You could borrow against the inflated value of land you already owned to buy more land. The insanity of the bubble. By 1989, the Japanese real estate market had become completely detached from reality. The total value of all land in Japan was estimated at $20 trillion. That was 4 times the value of all real estate in the United States, even though the United States had 25 times more land and twice the population. The land beneath the Imperial Palace in central Tokyo, an area of about 1.4 square miles, was said to be worth more than the entire state of California. Think about that. A patch of land in downtown Tokyo was theoretically worth more than all the real estate, all the farms, all the businesses, and all the homes in the largest state in America. It was madness. But it was a madness that had been engineered by the policies forced on Japan by the Plaza Accord. The stock market was equally insane. The Nikkei 225 index, which tracks Japan's largest companies, had been at around 13,000 points in 1985. By December 1989, it had rocketed to 38,915 points. It had tripled in 4 years. Japanese banks, Japanese insurance companies, Japanese pension funds, all of them were levered to the hilt, borrowing cheap money to buy stocks and real estate at prices that made no economic sense. They believed the bubble would never pop. They believed that land prices in Japan only went up. They believed they had discovered a new economic model that defied gravity. They were wrong, and the people who designed the Plaza Accord knew they were wrong, because this was the plan all along. The United States had forced Japan into an impossible situation. The Plaza Accord had destroyed Japan's export competitiveness. The Bank of Japan's response had been to inflate a massive bubble, and now all that was needed was for that bubble to burst. And it would burst, because bubbles always burst. The only question was when. The wealth evaporation begins. On the first trading day of 1990, the Nikkei stood at its all-time peak, and then it started to fall. At first, it was gradual. A few hundred points here, a rally, then another drop, but by March, the decline had become a rout. By October 1990, the Nikkei had lost 10,000 points. It had fallen nearly 30% from its peak. The real estate market followed. Property values in Tokyo, which had been climbing for a decade, suddenly stopped rising, and then they started to fall. Slowly at first, then faster. The Bank of Japan, terrified by the bubble it had created, had started raising interest rates in 1989. It was trying to cool the economy gently, to let some air out of the bubble without popping it. But there is no such thing as gently deflating a bubble of this magnitude. When asset prices started falling, the entire structure of debt that had been built on top of those assets began to collapse. Japanese corporations had borrowed billions of yen using real estate as collateral. When property values fell, the collateral was no longer sufficient to cover the loans. Banks demanded more collateral or repayment. Companies couldn't pay, they defaulted. Japanese banks, which had lent recklessly during the bubble, were now sitting on mountains of bad loans, loans that would never be repaid. The official estimate was that Japanese banks were holding over $1 trillion in non-performing loans by the mid-1990s. But the real number was almost certainly higher because banks were hiding their losses, pretending that worthless assets were still valuable. This is where the long-term devastation began. Because when banks are insolvent, they stop lending. And when banks stop lending, the entire economy seizes up. Companies can't get loans to expand. Consumers can't get mortgages. Investment freezes. Growth stops. Japan entered what would later be called the lost decades. But it wasn't a natural economic cycle. It wasn't bad luck or poor management. It was the direct and predictable result of the Plaza Accord. The real cost in human terms. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. Between 1990 and 2003, Japanese household wealth fell by $15 trillion. The Nikkei, which had peaked at 38,115 in December 1989, would not return to even half that level for more than 30 years. As of today, it still hasn't fully recovered. Real estate prices in Tokyo fell by 70% from their peak. Property that had been bought at the height of the bubble in 1989 was still underwater in 2020. Families who had taken out mortgages to buy homes in the late 1980s found themselves trapped in negative equity for decades. Japanese corporations, which had been the envy of the world in 1985, became zombies. They were kept alive by banks that couldn't afford to let them fail, but they weren't healthy enough to grow or innovate. They just existed, limping along, laying off workers, cutting wages, and destroying the future prospects of an entire generation. Unemployment, which had been virtually non-existent in Japan during the bubble years, started to rise. The lifetime employment system that had defined Japanese corporate culture began to break down. Young people graduating from university in the 1990s and 2000s faced a job market that had no room for them. They were called the lost generation, people who would never achieve the prosperity their parents had known. And here's the cruelest part. While Japan was collapsing, the United States was booming. The 1990s were the greatest decade of economic growth in American history. The tech bubble, the dot-com boom, the rise of Silicon Valley, all of it happened while Japan was mired in deflation and stagnation. The Plaza Accord had worked exactly as intended. It had transferred wealth and economic momentum from Japan to the United States. It had crippled a competitor and secured American dominance for another generation. The corporate destruction. By the mid-1990s, the scale of the disaster was undeniable. Japanese companies that had been global leaders were now fighting for survival. Sony, which had dominated consumer electronics, was being overtaken by Korean competitors like Samsung. Toyota, which had terrified Detroit in the 1980s, was struggling with shrinking profit margins and a stagnant domestic market. But the real carnage was in the financial sector. Japanese banks, which had once been the largest in the world by market capitalization, were revealed to be hollow shells. In 1989, the top 10 banks in the world by market value were all Japanese. By 2000, not a single Japanese bank was in the top 10. The Industrial Bank of Japan, Dai-ichi Kangyo Bank, Sumitomo Bank, these were institutions that had financed Japan's rise to economic superpower status. They had lent money to build the bullet trains, the steel mills, the car factories. They had been instruments of national power. Now they were bankrupt. The Japanese government had to step in with massive bailouts to prevent a total collapse of the financial system. Taxpayer money was poured into these failed institutions to keep them afloat. It was socialism for bankers, paid for by a population that was already suffering. And the bailouts didn't even work. The banks were kept alive, but they didn't recover. They became zombie institutions, just like the corporations they had lent to. They stopped taking risks. They stopped lending to new businesses. They became obstacles to growth rather than engines of it. The deflation trap. But the asset price collapse was just the beginning of Japan's nightmare. What came next was something even more insidious. Deflation. When asset prices are falling, when wages are stagnant, when unemployment is rising, people stop spending. They hoard cash. They delay purchases. They wait for prices to fall further. And when people stop spending, businesses cut production. They lay off workers. They lower prices to try to attract customers. This creates a vicious cycle. Falling prices lead to falling wages. Falling wages lead to less spending. Less spending leads to more falling prices. The economy spirals downward and there's no natural floor. Japan fell into this deflation trap in the mid-1990s, and it stayed there for 2 decades. The Bank of Japan cut interest rates to zero. It couldn't cut them any lower. It printed money and bought government bonds in a desperate attempt to create inflation. Nothing worked. The Japanese people, scarred by the collapse of the bubble, refused to spend. They saved obsessively. The household savings rate in Japan remained among the highest in the world, even as interest rates on those savings approached zero. People were literally paying banks to hold their money because they were so terrified of losing it in another crash. This was the psychological damage that the Plaza Accord had inflicted. It had broken the confidence of an entire nation. The Japanese people had been told that their economy was invincible, that their system was superior to the American model. And then they had watched it all crumble in the span of a decade. The government tried everything. Massive infrastructure spending, tax cuts, subsidies for industries, interest rate manipulation, quantitative easing. Nothing could restart the engine of growth. By the 2000s, Japan had become a cautionary tale. Economists around the world studied Japan's lost decades to understand what not to do, but they missed the point. Japan's stagnation wasn't the result of policy mistakes made in Tokyo. It was the result of a financial ambush executed in New York in 1985. The geopolitical consequences. The destruction of Japan's economy had consequences that went far beyond stock prices and real estate values. It fundamentally altered the balance of power in Asia and cemented American dominance in the Pacific. In the 1980s, there had been serious discussions in Washington about whether Japan might eventually challenge American leadership in the region. Japanese investment was pouring into Southeast Asia. Japanese companies were building factories in Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia. The yen was becoming a regional currency for trade. There was even talk of a yen bloc, an Asian economic zone centered on Tokyo rather than Washington. It would have been a direct challenge to American financial hegemony. The Plaza Accord killed that possibility. After the crash, Japan had no money to invest abroad. Its companies were too busy trying to survive at home. Its banks were too broken to finance regional development. The dream of a yen bloc evaporated. Into that vacuum stepped China. In the 1990s and 2000s, while Japan stagnated, China rose. Chinese factories started producing the cheap goods that Japanese factories used to make. Chinese companies started competing with Japanese brands in global markets. And Chinese influence in Asia started to grow in ways that Japanese influence never could after 1990. The irony is bitter. The United States had crushed Japan to maintain American dominance in Asia. But in doing so, it had inadvertently created the conditions for the rise of a far more powerful challenger. China learned from Japan's mistake. It watched what happened when you let your currency appreciate too quickly. It watched what happened when you let asset bubbles inflate. And it made sure never to sign its own Plaza Accord. The generational theft. But the most tragic consequence of the Plaza Accord wasn't geopolitical. It was human. An entire generation of Japanese people had their futures stolen. The young people who entered the workforce in the 1990s and 2000s faced an economy that offered no opportunities. The companies weren't hiring. The ones that were hiring offered only temporary contracts with no benefits, no job security, and no path to advancement. These workers were called freeders, a combination of the English word free and the German word Arbeiter, meaning worker. They were people trapped in permanent part-time employment, unable to afford marriage, unable to buy homes, unable to start families. Japan's birth rate, which had been declining slowly since the 1970s, went into freefall after the crash. By the 2000s, Japan's population was shrinking. There weren't enough young people to support the aging population. The demographic crisis that Japan faces today, the crisis that threatens to bankrupt the social security system, has its roots in the economic devastation of the lost decades. And those lost decades have their roots in the Plaza Accord. The elderly Japanese who had lived through the miracle years, who had built the factories and the export economy, watched their savings evaporate. The pensions they had been promised were cut. The benefits they had earned were reduced. They had sacrificed everything to build a prosperous nation, and in their old age, they saw it collapse. There was a particular cruelty in what happened to Japan. The country had played by the rules. It had been a loyal American ally. It had opened its markets to American goods. It had stationed American troops on its soil. It had supported American foreign policy. And in return, when Japan became too successful, too competitive, too rich, the United States destroyed it. The modern reality. Today, Japan is a shadow of what it could have been. The economy that was supposed to overtake the United States in the 1980s is now smaller in GDP terms than it was in 1995. Adjusted for inflation, the average Japanese worker earns less today than they did 30 years ago. Walk through Tokyo today and you can still see the remnants of the bubble era. The skyscrapers built in the late 1980s. The infrastructure projects that were supposed to showcase Japanese technological superiority. But they stand as monuments to a future that never arrived. Japanese companies that survived the crash did so by becoming conservative. They stopped innovating, they stopped taking risks, they cut research and development budgets, they focused on protecting what they had rather than building what could be. This is why Japan, which invented the portable music player with the Walkman, completely missed the smartphone revolution. This is why Japanese electronics companies, which dominated the world in 1985, were overtaken by Korean and Chinese competitors. The economic trauma of the lost decades killed the entrepreneurial spirit that had powered the Japanese miracle. The Japanese government is still fighting the aftermath of the Plaza Accord. The Bank of Japan has kept interest rates at zero or negative for over 2 decades. It has bought so many government bonds and corporate assets that it now owns a significant portion of the entire Japanese stock market. It is, in effect, nationalizing the economy through monetary policy. And none of it has worked. GDP growth remains anemic. Inflation, when it appears at all, is driven by imported oil prices rather than domestic demand. Wages are stagnant. The population is aging and shrinking. The debt to GDP ratio is the highest in the developed world, over 250%. Japan is trapped. It cannot raise interest rates without triggering a debt crisis. It cannot cut spending without deepening the recession. It cannot inflate its way out because the people refuse to spend. It is a permanent economic invalid, dependent on central bank life support. The lost decades aren't over. The most damning evidence of the Plaza Accord, its legacy is this. Japan's lost decades aren't actually over. They just keep going. Every few years, economists declare that Japan has finally turned the corner, that growth is returning, that the nightmare is ending. And every time, they're wrong. A global financial crisis hits, or a tsunami devastates the country, or a pandemic shuts down the economy, and Japan slides back into stagnation. Because the fundamental problem was never fixed. The wealth was never rebuilt. The damage was too deep. There are Japanese people alive today who have never experienced a booming economy. An entire generation has grown up in a country where the assumption is decline, where the expectation is that the future will be worse than the past. That psychological scar is perhaps the cruelest legacy of all. And the question that haunts Japan today is the same question that haunted it in 1985. What do you do when your most important ally is also your most dangerous rival? What do you do when the country that guarantees your security is the same country that will destroy your economy if you become too successful? Japan learned the answer the hard way. You do what you're told, you sign the agreement, you accept the terms, you sacrifice your future for the sake of the relationship. Because in the end, that's what the Plaza Accord really was. It was a loyalty test, and Japan passed by destroying itself. Who really won the story of the Plaza Accord is the story of how you can lose everything by winning. Japan won the economic competition of the 1970s and early 1980s. Its companies were better. Its workers were more productive. Its products were superior. and for that success, it was punished. The United States didn't defeat Japan on the factory floor or in the marketplace. It defeated Japan in a conference room at the Plaza Hotel using financial leverage and geopolitical blackmail. The $2 trillion that evaporated from Japan's economy didn't just disappear into thin air. Wealth doesn't vanish, it transfers. And in this case, it transferred to the United States. American companies, freed from Japanese competition, regained market share. American workers, protected by a weaker dollar, kept their jobs. American financial institutions, unburdened by the kind of bad loans that destroyed Japanese banks, dominated global finance for another generation. The Plaza Accord was the most successful economic weapon ever deployed. It achieved what tariffs and trade wars never could. It didn't just level the playing field, it tilted it permanently in America's favor. And the most remarkable thing? Japan never fought back. It never defaulted on its dollar holdings. It never pulled its cooperation from American military alliances. It never sought revenge. It just quietly accepted its fate and faded from the world stage. Today, when economists talk about currency manipulation, when they discuss the dangers of asset bubbles, when they warn about the risks of capital flow imbalances, they're really talking about the lessons of the Plaza Accord. But they never frame it honestly. They never say what it actually was, a deliberate act of economic warfare by the United States against its most loyal ally. The British Empire bankrupted itself fighting Hitler and never recovered. Japan bankrupted itself competing with America and suffered the same fate. The only difference is that Britain can say it fought for a noble cause. Japan's only crime was being too good at capitalism. The signing ceremony at the Plaza Hotel lasted less than an hour. The 5 finance ministers shook hands. They posed for photographs. They gave speeches about international cooperation and shared prosperity. And then they went home. Within 5 years, Japan's economic miracle was over. Within 10 years, it was a cautionary tale. Within 20 years, it was a forgotten giant. That piece of paper signed on September 22nd, 1985, destroyed more wealth than any war, any natural disaster, any financial crisis in modern history. And it was done with a pen, not a bomb. It was done with exchange rates, not armies. It was done with the quiet, ruthless efficiency of financial power. Japan signed the Plaza Accord to save its alliance with America. But in doing so, it signed away its future. The empire didn't fall. It was sold off piece by piece to pay the bill for trusting the wrong partner.